The lie was presented on a silver platter, as so many of the cruelest lies were in that house. "Honora, you will explain this discrepancy," Lady Millicent Draycott said, her voice not raised, never raised, but chilled to a fine, sharp point. She tapped a perfectly manicured finger on the household ledger, open on the polished mahogany of the morning room desk. 17 shillings and 4 pence unaccounted for. From the butcher's bill. Honora Abbott stood before her aunt, hands clasped loosely at her waist. She did not look at the ledger. She already knew the entry by heart. She had balanced it herself not 3 nights ago. She knew the sum was correct. She also knew that arguing was a fool's errand. "I will examine it again, Aunt," she said, her own voice a quiet counterpoint to the room's cold grandeur. It was a voice that had learned, through long and bitter practice, to betray nothing. No anger, no fear, no despair. "You will do more than examine it," Lady Draycott replied, her gaze sweeping over Honora's plain gray dress, a garment that was less a choice and more a uniform of her station in the house. Unpaid companion, unofficial bookkeeper, invisible niece. "You will find the error, or you will replace the sum from your quarterly allowance." Honora inclined her head. A quarterly allowance of £5 did not easily accommodate the loss of 17 shillings. But that was the point. The point was the pressure, the reminder of dependence, the slow, grinding erosion of her spirit. She had been living at Merrodene, her uncle's estate, for 6 years, ever since her parents' death had left her penniless and reliant on the grudging charity of her mother's sister. In those 6 years, she had learned that her worth was measured entirely by her utility and her silence. As she reached for the heavy ledger, a new footman entered the room, silent as a shadow, to lay the fire. He was tall and broad-shouldered, moving with a strange, contained stillness that seemed at odds with the blue and silver livery of the Draycott household. Honora had only noted his arrival a week prior. His name, she'd been told, was Jem. He did not look at them, his attention fixed on the grate, on the precise placement of kindling and coal. Yet Honora felt his presence as a new, unreadable element in the room's suffocating atmosphere. He knelt, his back to them, but she could feel the weight of his listening. Lady Draycott dismissed her with a wave. "See to it. I will not have carelessness in my accounts. It is a sign of a careless mind, and a careless mind is a gateway to moral decay." Honora retreated, the heavy book cradled in her arms. She did not cry. She had learned long ago that tears changed nothing. They were a currency with no value in this house. Instead, she went to the small, cold study where she was permitted to work. The room smelled of old paper and beeswax, a scent she had come to associate with the lonely precision of numbers. Numbers, unlike people, were honest. They did not have moods. They did not flatter or deceive. They simply were. And the numbers in this ledger, she knew, were correct, which meant the error was not an error at all. It was an invention, a tool of control, as sharp and as cold as her aunt's voice. She spent the afternoon verifying every entry, cross-referencing every receipt from the butcher in Marley for the last 6 months. Her handwriting, small and neat, filled a spare sheet of foolscap with columns of figures. By dusk, she had her proof. The 17 shillings and 4 pence had not vanished. They had been paid to the chandler for extra tallow candles, an order her aunt had made herself and evidently forgotten, an order for which she had taken the cash from the butcher's envelope. To present this evidence, however, would be an act of aggression. It would be an accusation of fault against Lady Draycott, a crime far greater than losing money. It would be a battle Honora could not win. The punishment for being right was always more severe than the punishment for being wrong. So she would do what she always did. She would find a way. She would adjust, recalculate, and pull the missing sum from other, more flexible budgets. A shilling from ribbons, 2 from soap, another from beeswax. A delicate, invisible robbing of Peter to pay Paul that would leave the household running and her aunt's pride intact. It was the thankless, silent art of her survival. That evening, after the family had retired, she returned to the study. The house was quiet, groaning softly around her as old houses do. She lit a single candle, its small flame pushing back the heavy darkness. She opened the ledger, the real one, and the small notebook where she kept her private calculations. Dipping her pen in the ink, she began the careful, painstaking work of weaving a truth that would be accepted over the truth that simply was. She was so absorbed, she did not hear the soft footsteps in the hall. She did not notice the door creak open a fraction of an inch. She did not see the tall shape of the new footman, Jem, standing in the shadows, his face unreadable. He had been on his way to the kitchens for a glass of water when he saw the sliver of light from under the study door. Curiosity, a thing he rarely indulged, had guided him closer. He had stood there for a full 10 minutes, watching her. He had seen the strain in her shoulders at dinner, the quiet way she endured her cousin Louisa's vapid chatter and her aunt's dismissive tone. Now he saw this. He saw the intense, focused line of her brow, the steady movement of her hand across the page, the pile of receipts held down by a small stone paperweight. He saw not a victim, but a strategist. He saw a mind at work, clear and sharp, and utterly alone. And Gideon Vaughan, Duke of Kestrel Chase, hiding in plain sight in a footman's livery, felt a flicker of something he had not felt in a very long time. It was not pity. It was something harder and more respectful. It was recognition. He had come to Merrodene under a false name to investigate the character and financial stability of Lord Draycott, a man with whom his solicitors were urging a partnership. He had expected to find rot or incompetence. He had not expected to find this. A quiet, diligent woman holding the entire crumbling facade together with ink and sheer force of will. He watched her for another moment as she finally blotted the page, a small, weary sigh escaping her lips. Then, as silently as he had come, he retreated into the darkness. The image of her pale face in the candlelight burned into his mind. The investigation, he decided, had just become infinitely more interesting. The next few days settled into a strange, quiet rhythm. Honora felt the footman's eyes on her. It was not the impertinent stare of a servant who knew his place, nor the furtive glance of one with improper intentions. It was a watchful, assessing gaze, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle. When he served her at table, his movements were economical and precise, his large hands surprisingly deft as he offered a serving dish or filled her water glass. He never spoke to her, not directly, but his presence was a low, constant hum in the background of her days. She found it unnerving. She was accustomed to being invisible, and his attention felt like a bright light cast upon a creature of the shadows. One afternoon, she was in the library, tasked with cataloging a new shipment of books her uncle had purchased but would likely never read. It was a dusty, tedious job, requiring her to climb a tall, rickety ladder to reach the highest shelves. As she stretched for a particularly high volume, the ladder gave a sickening lurch. She gasped, her fingers scrabbling for purchase on the smooth wood of the shelf. Before she could fall, A strong hand gripped the ladder's side, steadying it with unshakable force. She looked down, her heart hammering against her ribs, into the calm gray eyes of the footman, Jem. He held the ladder with one hand, his expression unreadable. "Thank you," she breathed, her voice shakier than she would have liked. He merely inclined his head. "Be careful, miss. The rung is cracked." He pointed to a spot near the base she had not noticed. She descended carefully, her composure returning with every step. Once on the solid floor, she smoothed her skirts. "I am in your debt." "There is no debt," he said, his voice a low baritone, surprisingly refined for a footman. It was the first time he had spoken more than a single word in her hearing. "It is my duty to see that the household is safe." His choice of words was peculiar. Not that she was safe, but that the household was safe, as if she were a part of its structure, like a beam or a floorboard, essential to its integrity. Before she could formulate a reply, he had released the ladder, given another slight bow, and was gone, leaving only the scent of clean linen and cold winter air in his wake. Honora stood for a long moment, staring at the empty doorway. The encounter was trivial, a momentary slip and a steadying hand, yet it felt significant. No one else in this house would have noticed the cracked rung. No one else would have been there to catch her. It was a small thing, a tiny act of competence and observation, but in her world, such things were rarer than jewels. The true turning point came a week later. Honora was in the study again, wrestling with the estate accounts. Lord Draycott, a man who preferred hunting to husbandry, had left the finances in a tangled mess. Bills were paid late, tenants' rents were recorded haphazardly, and there was a growing cloud of debt that her aunt preferred to ignore with aristocratic disdain. Honora was trying to bring order to the chaos, a task akin to weaving a fine tapestry in the middle of a hurricane. The door opened without a knock. It was Jem. He carried a tray with a single cup of tea and a small plate of biscuits, a service usually performed by one of the maids. He placed it on the edge of her desk, his movements deliberate. "I thought you might need this, miss," he said, his eyes flicking to the chaotic pile of papers. Honora stared at the cup. It was an astonishing breach of protocol. A footman did not simply decide a lady needed tea and bring it to her. "Who sent you?" she asked, her tone sharper than she intended. "No one," he replied, meeting her gaze directly. "I was in the kitchen. I saw the light. I know you work late." He paused. "The ledgers are a mess, aren't they?" The directness of the question startled her. It was not an inquiry. It was a statement of fact. He had looked at the papers on her desk and understood them in an instant. This was no ordinary footman. A flicker of suspicion, formless and strange, sparked within her. "The household accounts are a private matter," she said stiffly, her guard firmly up. He did not flinch from her cold tone. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, his voice dropping lower. "I can read a balance sheet, miss, and I can see that this estate is bleeding money. Lord Draycott is being cheated by his own steward." Honora's breath caught in her throat. She had suspected as much for months. The steward, a man named Fletcher Carmichael, was a cousin of a distant neighbor, a man whose charm was as polished as his riding boots, and whose explanations were always just a little too smooth. He was also a favored suitor for her beautiful, empty-headed cousin, Louisa. To voice such a suspicion would be to declare war on a man her aunt and uncle admired. "You have no right to say such a thing," she whispered, her eyes darting toward the door. "Look at the receipts for the seed grain," he said, ignoring her protest. His finger, blunt and clean, pointed to a specific document on her desk. The quantity is listed, but the price per bushel is 30% higher than the going rate in Marley. I checked this morning, and the delivery dockets, they are forged. The signature is not the same as the one from the corn chandler's regular invoices. She stared at him, her mind reeling. He had not only noticed, he had investigated. A footman. It was impossible. "Who are you?" she asked, the question blunt. He straightened up, his expression becoming shuttered once more. "I am a servant of this house, miss, and I do not like to see good people taken advantage of." He looked at her, his gray eyes holding a depth she could not fathom. "You are the only person in this house who cares if it stands or falls. I thought you should have the truth." He turned to leave. "Wait," she said, her voice barely audible. He stopped, his hand on the doorknob. She looked at the evidence he had pointed out, the damning papers that confirmed her darkest fears. She looked at the cup of tea, a simple human kindness in a world that had shown her none. She was alone, fighting a silent, losing battle. And now, from the most unlikely of quarters, an ally had appeared. An intelligent, observant, and dangerously knowledgeable ally. "Why?" she asked. "Why are you telling me this?" He turned back to face her. For a moment, the mask of the deferential servant slipped, and she saw something else in his face. A weariness, a strength, and a profound sense of authority. "Because," he said slowly, "honesty should be rewarded, not punished. And because I believe you are the only one capable of using this information correctly." With that, he was gone, leaving her with a cooling cup of tea, a pile of incriminating documents, and the bewildering certainty that the footman named Jem was the most dangerous and perhaps the most vital person she had ever met. A reluctant alliance had been forged, not with words, but with a shared glance at a fraudulent receipt. And Honora, for the first time in a long time, did not feel entirely alone. She took a sip of the tea. It was warm and strong, and it tasted, surprisingly, of hope. Their clandestine partnership began in earnest. They never spoke of it, never acknowledged it as anything more than a series of disconnected moments, but a silent understanding flowed between them. He would leave things for her, a sharpened quill placed by the inkwell, a small stack of timber delivery receipts left discreetly on a hallway table she was known to pass, a quiet word about a stable boy's report of fewer sheep than were on the count. Each was a piece of the puzzle, a breadcrumb on the trail of Fletcher Carmichael's deceptions. In return, she began to speak to him, not as a mistress to a servant, but as one strategist to another. When he brought in the coal scuttle for the study fire, she might murmur, "The miller's account does not align with the steward's report on the winter wheat." And he would reply, his back to her as he worked, "The miller's son is a talkative lad in the tavern at Marley. He speaks of short deliveries." It was a strange, disembodied collaboration, conducted in the margins of their prescribed roles. Honora felt a new energy coursing through her. The work was no longer a lonely burden. It was a mission. With each piece of evidence Jem provided, she meticulously updated a second, secret ledger. This one she kept hidden beneath a loose floorboard in her sparsely furnished room. It was a book of truths, a perfect, damning mirror to the official accounts. The house itself seemed to respond to her renewed purpose. Under her quiet, persistent guidance, waste was trimmed, orders were corrected, and a sense of order began to permeate the lower levels of the household. Mrs. Ingram, the stout, no-nonsense housekeeper who had always treated Honora with a grudging respect, began to seek her opinion openly. "Miss Abbott," she'd say, waylaying her in a corridor, "Mr. Carmichael has ordered another bolt of that French silk for the drawing-room curtains, but we've 2 bolts in storage already." And Honora would nod. "Thank you for telling me, Mrs. Ingram. I will see that the order is corrected." The housekeeper's approval was a small but significant victory. The loyalty of the staff, Honora was learning, was a powerful force. One by one, they began to turn to her, the quiet niece in the gray dress, as the true authority in the house. They saw her fairness, her memory for detail, her refusal to engage in the high-handed dramatics of her aunt. A cook would mention the butcher trying to pass off a lesser cut of meat. A groom would report a discrepancy in the purchase of new tack. Each report was a small stone laid in the foundation of her case against Carmichael. Gideon, watching all of this from his vantage point as Jem, felt his initial assessment of her deepen into a profound admiration. He saw how she managed the household not through command, but through competence. She never raised her voice, never threatened, never demeaned. She simply knew. She knew how many candles were in the stores, how many jars of preserves were in the larder, how many days a side of beef ought to last. And this knowledge, wielded quietly, was her power. He had come to Merodine expecting to find a house rotting from the head down. He found that it was. But he also found that it was being held up from the foundations by a single, slender pillar of integrity. His own feelings were becoming a complication he had not anticipated. He found himself looking for her, listening for the soft rustle of her skirts in the hallway. He noted the way a stray lock of brown hair would fall across her brow when she was concentrating, the small, almost imperceptible frown of focus on her lips. He had known countless beautiful women, women who glittered in ballrooms and charmed dinner tables. They were like polished glass. Honora was like forged steel, quiet and unassuming until you realized the strength contained within. He began to feel a fierce, protective urge that was entirely at odds with his mission. This was meant to be a simple business assessment. It was rapidly becoming something else entirely. The change did not go unnoticed. Fletcher Carmichael, who had long dismissed Honora as a mousy irrelevance, began to see her differently. He saw her speaking with the housekeeper. He saw the way the other servants would fall silent and straighten up when she entered a room. Most dangerously, he saw the new footman's constant, quiet proximity to her. Carmichael's access to the estate's funds, the very funds he was using to court Louisa and maintain his fashionable lifestyle, was being subtly curtailed. Orders were being questioned. Invoices were being scrutinized. He felt a gentle but insistent pressure on his web of deceit, and he traced it back to the silent woman in the study. His attention sharpened, turning from casual disdain to pointed suspicion. He began to make comments at the dinner table, laced with a polite venom intended for Honora. "One must be so careful with dependents, Lady Draycott," he said one evening, his smile not reaching his eyes. "They can begin to harbor resentments, to imagine they have a greater place than the one charity has afforded them." Honora met his gaze across the table, her expression serene. She did not rise to the bait. She simply placed her fork down and took a delicate sip of water. Her calm was more unnerving to him than any angry retort could have been. The first direct attack came a week later. Honora had sent a list of necessary supplies to the steward's office, as was her custom. When the goods arrived from Marley, the order of fine writing paper she had requested for the library was missing. In its place was a bolt of cheap, gaudy ribbon, the kind her cousin Louisa adored. When Honora questioned the deliveryman, he produced an order form signed by Carmichael, with the paper crossed out and the ribbon written in. Her own signature was still at the bottom, making it appear as if she had approved the frivolous change. Lady Draycott was incandescent. "Ribbons? while the roof tiles are in need of repair? Is this your idea of careful management, Honora? Wasting money on trinkets for your own vanity? I did not order the ribbon, Aunt, Honora said calmly. Your name is on the form. My name is on the form, but the alteration is not in my hand. Carmichael, standing beside Lady Draycott, adopted a look of pained sympathy. I fear Miss Abbott may be overwhelmed. Perhaps these duties are too much for her. It was a masterful stroke. He had not only sabotaged her work, but had used it to paint her as either incompetent or deceitful, all while appearing concerned for her welfare. Honora looked from his false face to her aunt's furious one. She had no proof. It was her word against his. And in this house, his word was gold, and hers was dust. She saw the trap closing around her. The small, subtle acts of sabotage were escalating. Carmichael was no longer content to simply steal. He was now moving to eliminate the only person who stood in his way. She held her head high, absorbed the unjust tirade without a word, and retreated. But as she walked away, she felt Jem's eyes on her back, and in his gaze, she did not see pity. She saw a cold, gathering storm. The quiet war for Merodine was about to become an open conflict. The final escalation was both swift and brutal. Fletcher Carmichael, realizing that his position was becoming more precarious by the day, decided on a definitive, destructive course of action. He and Lady Draycott conspired, their motives entwined, his of greed, hers of a jealous desire to maintain absolute control over her household and her niece. They would not merely discredit Honora, they would utterly destroy her reputation. Their weapon was the very thing Honora cherished most: the ledger. One night, while the house slept, Carmichael gained access to the study. He carefully removed a page from the middle of the book, a page detailing several large payments to local suppliers. In its place, he inserted a new page, one he had spent days meticulously forging. He was a skilled mimic of handwriting, and to a casual observer, the page looked perfect. It showed the same payments, but with one crucial, damning addition: a recurring withdrawal of £5, paid out weekly to a non-existent account, with a small, neat H.A. initialed beside each entry. The total amount stolen was over £50, a fortune that would spell ruin and likely prison for a woman in Honora's position. To complete the illusion, he doctored the final summary page, increasing the deficit by the exact amount. The next morning, the storm broke. Lady Draycott summoned Honora not to the morning room, but to the grand drawing room, where Lord Draycott sat looking bewildered, and Carmichael stood by the fireplace, the picture of grim discovery. The ledger lay open on a central table, like a body awaiting an inquest. Honora, Lady Draycott began, her voice trembling with manufactured fury. Mr. Carmichael has brought a most grievous matter to my attention. It appears we have a thief in this house. Honora felt a block of ice form in her stomach. She looked at the ledger, then at Carmichael's triumphant smirk. She knew, with chilling certainty, what had happened. There has been a systematic theft from the household accounts for months, Carmichael elaborated, his tone sorrowful. I was reviewing the books, and I found this. He gestured to the forged page. Regular payments, cleverly hidden, initialed by the perpetrator. Lord Draycott peered at the page. H.A.? Who is H.A.? Lady Draycott's gaze was venomous.
Do not play the fool, Elinor. You have been stealing from the very people who gave you shelter.
After all we have done for you, to be repaid with such treachery. Elinor walked slowly towards the table. She looked at the page. The forgery was good, but not perfect. The ink was a fraction too dark. The pressure of the pen on the initials was harder, angrier than her own careful script. But these were details no one else would see. She was trapped. "I did not write this," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "This is not my work." "Of course you would deny it," her aunt scoffed. "But the evidence is undeniable. £50! What have you done with it? Hidden it in your room?" She turned to her husband. "We must have her room searched, and the authorities must be called." Panic, cold and sharp, threatened to overwhelm Elinor, but she pushed it down. She had faced this woman's injustice for 6 years. She would not break now. "You will find nothing in my room, because there is nothing to find. I have never taken a single penny that was not mine." Carmichael stepped forward. "There is another matter. The new footman, Jem. He has been seen speaking with Miss Abbott on numerous occasions, in private. It is highly improper. I believe he may be her accomplice. He should be questioned as well." This was the masterstroke. By implicating Jem, he not only added weight to the accusation against her, but also moved to eliminate the man he correctly identified as her silent ally. Lady Draycott seized on it immediately. "Of course, the insolent man. I never liked his eyes. Have him brought here at once, and then dismiss him. I will not have thieves and conspirators under my roof." The butler was summoned. Orders were given. Elinor watched, a feeling of helpless dread washing over her. She had walked into a perfectly laid trap, and she had dragged Jem into it with her. In a few moments, he would be brought in, questioned, and thrown out without a reference, his life ruined because of her. She looked at Carmichael, who met her eyes with a look of pure, unadulterated victory. He had won. We'll take a very short break. If you don't want to miss new stories, please subscribe to the channel. The butler returned, his expression grave. "The footman is not in his quarters, my lady. His belongings are gone." A collective gasp went through the room. "He has fled," Lady Draycott declared triumphantly. "A confession of his guilt. He has run off with the money, no doubt, and left this wicked girl to face the consequences alone." The narrative was set. The footman was the mastermind, the thief who had seduced the weak-witted niece into helping him. It was a neater, more plausible story. Enora's fate, however, remained the same. She was, at best, a foolish accomplice. At worst, a jilted conspirator. "Lock her in her room," Lady Draycott commanded. "We will send for the magistrate from Marley in the morning." Elinor did not protest. She allowed the housekeeper, Mrs. Ingram, to lead her from the room. The woman's face was a mask of distress. As they climbed the stairs, away from the furious voices in the drawing room, Mrs. Ingram pressed a small, folded piece of paper into Enora's hand. "From him," she whispered, her eyes full of a fearful sympathy. "He left before dawn. He told me to give you this." Elinor was taken to her room, the key turning loudly in the lock behind her. She stood in the center of the small, cold space, her world collapsing around her. He had run. Jem, her silent ally, had abandoned her. The thought was a physical blow, more painful than any of her aunt's accusations. She had trusted him. She had believed he was different. Now he was gone, and she was left to face the ruin alone. Her hands trembled as she unfolded the small piece of paper. On it, written in a bold, strong hand that was nothing like the footman's supposed station, were only 3 words. Trust me. Plainly, she stared at the words. Plainly. It was a word they had used between them, a quiet code for the unvarnished truth. The miller's accounts were plainly wrong. The steward's excuses were plainly lies. It was a promise of honesty in a world of deceit. He had not fled. He had retreated. He was not abandoning the fight. He was repositioning his forces. The thought was so audacious, so impossible, that it felt like madness. To trust a runaway footman, a man she didn't even know, against the combined power of her family and a magistrate. It was absurd. And yet, she thought of his calm, grey eyes, the quiet competence of his hands, the way he had seen her when no one else had. He had never lied to her. He had brought her truth after truth, piece by piece. Her own carefully constructed case against Carmichael was still hidden beneath her floorboards. She was not entirely defenseless. Clutching the note in her hand, Honora made a choice. She would not despair. She would not weep. She would do as he asked. She would trust him. Plainly. She sat on the edge of her bed, the note held tight in her fist, and waited for the dawn, and for the magistrate. Her trial was coming, and she would face it. The following morning, Merodine was saturated with an atmosphere of tense, grim theatre. Lady Draycott had orchestrated the scene for maximum dramatic effect. The assembly was not to be a private family matter, but a semi-public tribunal. She had invited not only the magistrate, a portly and pompous man named Mr. Farrow, but also the Dowager Countess of Penrose. The Countess was the most influential figure in the county, a woman whose sharp tongue and even sharper mind were legendary. Her presence would lend an unimpeachable gravity to the proceedings, ensuring that the verdict on Honora's character, once delivered, would be final and absolute. Honora was brought down to the drawing room like a prisoner to the dock. She had dressed with care in her plainest grey gown, her hair pulled back severely. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her dishevelled or weeping. Her face was pale but composed, her back straight. As she entered, she met the shrewd, assessing gaze of the Dowager Countess. The old woman's eyes, bright as a bird's, missed nothing. The room was arranged like a courtroom. Mr. Farrow sat behind a large desk, looking important. Lord and Lady Draycott were seated to one side, playing the part of aggrieved victims. Fletcher Carmichael stood near the fireplace, a sheaf of papers in his hand, ready to act as prosecutor. "Miss Abbott," the magistrate began, his voice booming unnaturally in the quiet room. "A most serious charge has been laid against you, of theft and embezzlement from your guardians. What have you to say for yourself?" "I am not guilty," Honora said, her voice clear and steady. It did not carry far, but it carried true. Carmichael stepped forward. "With respect, magistrate, the evidence is irrefutable." He presented the ledger, opening it to the forged page. "Here we have it, in Miss Abbott's own purview, sums of money siphoned off week after week. And here," he produced a separate document with a flourish, "is a statement I prepared, summarizing the timeline of the thefts." Mr. Farrow peered at the documents through his spectacles. Yes. Damning. Very damning indeed. And the accomplice, this Footman, has fled?
confirms the whole sordid business.
We believe he preyed upon my niece's weakness of character, Lady Draycott added, dabbing at a dry eye with a lace handkerchief. She was ever a suggestible, resentful girl. The Dowager Countess made a small, impatient sound.
Get on with it, Millicent. If the girl is a thief, present your proof. All I see is a book and a deal of amateur theatrics. Anyone can write a number in a ledger.
Carmichael flushed slightly at the insult.
The proof, your ladyship, is in the consistency of the entries, and in the fact that Miss Abbott, as the sole keeper of these books, is the only one with the opportunity. He turned his venomous gaze on Honora.
Unless you wish to claim that someone else made these entries? Someone with a reason to frame you? He thought he had her trapped. If she accused him, it would be the desperate, baseless cry of a cornered criminal. Honora met his gaze. The page you have presented is a forgery. A gasp went around the room. Mr. Farrow sputtered. A forgery? A baseless accusation, madam. On what grounds do you make such a claim? The ink is not a perfect match to the rest of the book, Honora stated calmly. The paper stock is subtly different, and the handwriting, while a skilled imitation, does not possess the same flow as my own. The pressure is wrong. The Dowager Countess leaned forward, her interest piqued. An expert opinion, it seems. Have you any other proof for your fantastical claims, child? I do, Honora said. She had spent the night considering her options. Jem's note had told her to trust him, but it had not told her to be passive. She had to fight with the weapons she possessed. I have kept my own records. A private ledger detailing the true income and expenditures of this estate, including Mr. Carmichael's systematic inflation of costs for his own profit. The color drained from Carmichael's face. Lady Draycott shot to her feet. Lies! The desperate slander of a convicted thief! Then you will not object, Honora said, her voice cutting through the hysteria, to having my room searched for this ledger. I will show you where it is. And you will not object to having both ledgers and Mr. Carmichael's invoices examined by an independent expert in paper and ink. A tense silence fell. Honora had turned their own weapon against them. She had called for evidence, for examination, for the very scrutiny they had hoped to avoid. Carmichael was beginning to sweat. The Dowager Countess watched him, a slow, predatory smile touching her lips. She recognized the scent of a cornered rat. Well, Fletcher, the Countess drawled, what say you? Are you afraid of an expert? Before Carmichael could stammer out a reply, the main doors of the drawing room swung open. The butler stood there, his face pale with shock. My lord, a visitor. He insisted. And then a man walked into the room. He was dressed not in livery, but in the immaculate, understated tailoring of a man of immense wealth and power. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and moved with a quiet, unshakable authority. His gray eyes, cold as a winter sea, swept the room, taking in the scene with a glance. He looked at Honora, and for a fraction of a second, his expression softened with a message of reassurance. It was Jem. Lady Draycott found her voice first. You! How dare you show your face here, you wretched thief! Seize him! The magistrate, flustered, looked as if he might try to do just that. But the Dowager Countess suddenly gasped, her eyes wide. Good heavens, she breathed, rising slowly to her feet. Your Grace. The man inclined his head to her. Lady Penrose, I apologize for the intrusion, and for my attire on our last meeting. Lord Draycott stared, his mouth agape. Your Grace, what is the meaning of this? Who is this man? The man's cold gaze settled on the master of the house. My name, he said, his voice resonating with an authority that dwarfed everyone in the room, is Gideon Vaughan, Duke of Kestrel Chase, and I have come to provide testimony in the matter of Miss Honora Abbott. The revelation fell like a thunderclap. Lady Draycott sank back into her chair, her face a mask of horrified disbelief. Fletcher Carmichael looked as though he had been turned to stone. Honora simply stared, her mind struggling to connect the quiet footman who brought her tea with the powerful nobleman who now commanded the room. Gideon. His name was Gideon. He walked calmly to the center of the room, his presence utterly transforming the balance of power. He was no longer an accused accomplice. He was the highest-ranking witness, a peer of the realm, whose word was ironclad. I have been a guest in this house for 3 weeks, Gideon began, his voice level and devoid of emotion. Under an assumed name, for the purpose of assessing Lord Draycott's suitability for a business partnership. An assessment that is now complete. He let that hang in the air for a moment before continuing. During that time, I have had ample opportunity to observe the running of this household. I have observed Miss Abbott's tireless and meticulous management, and I have observed Mr. Carmichael's persistent and audacious fraud. He produced a slim leather folio from his coat. This is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of fact. He laid a document on the desk before the stunned magistrate. This is a sworn affidavit from the corn chandler in Marley, stating that his signatures on Mr. Carmichael's delivery dockets are forgeries. He has been billing this estate for phantom deliveries for over a year. He laid down another. This is a report from my own man of business, who spent yesterday in Marley. It details the market prices for seed, timber, and livestock for the past 6 months, cross-referenced with the prices Mr. Carmichael has been charging to the estate. The discrepancy amounts to over £200. He continued, his voice a relentless, factual hammer, laying down document after document. An affidavit from a stable hand Carmichael had dismissed to cover his tracks. A statement from the miller's son. A detailed analysis of the forged page in the ledger, conducted that very morning by an expert he had brought from London. The ink, Gideon stated, looking directly at Carmichael, contains a chemical binder not commercially available until 3 months ago. The entries, which purport to be over a year old, are therefore impossible. Carmichael, white-faced and trembling, finally broke.
This is absurd! A conspiracy! He and the girl, they planned this together!
Gideon turned his head slowly, fixing the man with a look of such chilling contempt that Carmichael flinched back. You are a forger and a thief, sir. You have preyed upon a good man's inattention and a good woman's integrity. You are fortunate that I am merely exposing you and not calling you out. The quiet threat of a duel, an archaic but still potent honorific, hung in the air. He then turned his attention to Lady Draycott, who seemed to shrink under his gaze. And you, madam, you have exploited your niece, overworked her, and when her honesty became an inconvenience, you conspired to have her falsely imprisoned. You have shown a cruelty and a lack of character that I find breathtaking. The public humiliation was absolute. The Dowager Countess watched, her expression one of grim satisfaction. Justice, in her opinion, was always a bracing spectacle. Mr. Farrow, the magistrate, now understood which way the wind was blowing. He cleared his throat, suddenly all officious action. Mr. Carmichael, you will consider yourself under arrest. Lord Draycott, I suggest you get your house in order. This entire affair is a disgrace." Amidst the wreckage of her aunt's ambition and Carmichael's schemes, Honora stood still. She had been vindicated. The truth, her quiet, stubborn truth, had finally come to light. But the shock of Gideon's revelation was still echoing through her. He was a duke. The man who had steadied her ladder, who had shared secrets with her over the coal scuttle, was one of the most powerful men in England. The gulf between them, which had once been a matter of station, now seemed as wide and as deep as the ocean. As Carmichael was led away and Lady Draycott sat in stunned, silent ruin, Gideon walked towards Honora. He stopped before her, ignoring everyone else in the room. The cold mask of the avenging duke fell away, and she saw again the quiet, steady man she had come to know as Jem. "Miss Abbott," he said, his voice for her alone. "Are you well?" She could only nod, her throat too tight for words. He looked at her, his gray eyes holding an expression of profound respect. "I came to this house to assess its character," he said, his voice clear and resonant, carrying to every corner of the silent room. "I found it in you." He went down on one knee. A collective, audible gasp filled the room. The Duke of Kestrel Chase was kneeling on the Aubusson carpet of Merodine before the penniless niece in the plain gray dress. "I have spent years in a world of calculation and duty," he said, his gaze locked with hers. "My life has been a ledger of assets and liabilities. You have reminded me of a different kind of accounting. The accounting of integrity, of loyalty, of quiet strength. These are the things I value. This is the wealth I wish to have in my house." He took her hand, his touch firm and warm. "I am not offering to rescue you, Miss Abbott. You have no need of rescuing. You are the strongest person I have ever met. I am asking you to be my partner. I am asking you to be my wife. Plainly." The word hung between them, their private promise now a public vow. Honora looked down at this impossible man, this duke who had dressed as a footman, who had seen her value when she was invisible to everyone else. She saw not a title or a fortune, but the man who had brought her tea, who had steadied her ladder, who had trusted her and asked for her trust in return. The tears she had refused to shed for years of sorrow now pricked at her eyes. But these were tears of a different kind. They were tears of overwhelming, unbelievable joy. She thought of her hidden ledger, the book of truths. She thought of his note. She thought of a future she had never, in her wildest dreams, dared to imagine. A future of partnership, of respect, of honesty. A future where she would not have to fight to be seen, because she was already known. Her hand tightened on his. "Yes," she whispered. Then, her voice growing stronger, clearer for all the world to hear. "Yes, plainly." 1 year later. The autumn sun streamed through the tall library windows of Alderbrook, casting long, warm stripes across the Turkish carpet. The air smelled of beeswax, old leather, and the faint, sweet scent of late roses drifting in from the gardens. Honora Vaughan, Duchess of Kestrel Chase, sat at a magnificent oak desk, a large, well-bound ledger open before her. Her handwriting, still neat and precise, moved across the page, tracking the accounts of an estate that was not crumbling, but thriving. It was a happy, prosperous place, and its books balanced to the penny. She paused, dipping her pen in the inkwell, and her gaze fell upon a smaller, plainer book that sat on a place of honor on a nearby shelf. It was the secret ledger she had kept at Merrodine, its pages filled with the evidence that had saved her. Gideon had insisted she bring it with them. He called it the first charter of their household. It was a reminder of where they had begun and of the foundation upon which their life together was built. Truth, meticulously recorded. The library door opened, and Gideon entered. He no longer wore livery, but the quiet, well-made clothes of a man at ease on his own land. The past year had softened the hard lines around his eyes, replacing the guarded watchfulness with a quiet contentment. He came to stand behind her, his hands resting gently on her shoulders. "Still balancing the world, my love?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. She leaned her head back against him, a smile touching her lips. "Someone must. You would spend a fortune on new breeds of sheep if I did not watch you." "A worthy investment," he countered, his hands tightening slightly. "But I concede, your accounting is better than mine." He was silent for a moment, simply holding her, the two of them looking out at the gardens she had spent the summer restoring. The once neglected rose beds were now a riot of color, thriving under her patient care. "Do you ever miss it?" he asked quietly. "The fight?" Honora considered this. She thought of the cold rooms of Merrodine, of her aunt's chilling voice, of Carmichael's sneer. Her uncle, humbled and shamed, had offered a halting apology before retreating into a quiet country life. Her aunt had retired to Bath, her social standing in the county obliterated. Her cousin Louisa had married a minor baronet with more sense than charm, and was, by all accounts, tolerably happy. The battle was over. "No," she said finally. "I do not miss the fight, but I am grateful for what it taught me." "And what is that?" Gideon asked, his lips brushing her hair. "That the most valuable things are not recorded in ledgers," she said, turning in her chair to face him. She took his hand, her fingers lacing with his. "Trust, honesty, seeing someone for precisely who they are." She looked into his calm gray eyes. "And being seen in return." He lifted her hand to his lips, his gaze holding hers. It was not a gesture of high romance or courtly drama. It was a simple, profound acknowledgement, a quiet statement of fact, a truth plainly spoken between two people who had found each other in a world of lies. Together they stood by the window, watching as the sun set over their peaceful, well-ordered home, the books balanced, the past reconciled, and the future stretching before them, clear and bright and true. Thank you for listening to the story all the way to the end. Please tell us which city you're watching from and what the story made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss new stories.